Have you ever wondered why are there so many cars with diesel engines in Europe? And why did diesel cars experience a sales boom that lasted for almost 20 years in Europe? And why this phenomenon didn't occur in pretty much any other major car market in the world? The usual explanation behind this is that it's a combination of consumer preference and tax benefits. Unfortunately, this explanation doesn't tell even a fraction of the story. So that's why today I'll tell you the full story of how and why diesel cars became so popular in Europe. I will present evidence of how, in this case, consumer preference is just a construct, and how the mass dieselization of Europe is a result of government actions. And we will also learn about the long-term consequences of these actions for European citizens. And finally, we will talk about some truly frightening and eye-opening lessons we can learn from Europe's experience with diesel cars. Our story begins way back in 1973 with the first oil crisis, which occurred when the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, initiated a total oil embargo against countries that had supported Israel during the Fourth Arab-Israeli War.
The oil-producing countries of the Arab world decided to use their oil as a political weapon.
The result was a shock and dramatic shortage of crude oil that caused the price of a barrel of oil and derived products to increase by 300% shortly after the embargo was put into place. The 1973 oil crisis has been a pivotal moment for the global automotive industry, but also global energy markets, as well as politics and economy. The shock and sheer inconvenience of the crisis made many countries around the world completely change their approach towards energy. France is perhaps one of the most illustrative examples. At the time of the oil crisis, most of France's electricity came from foreign oil. Oil was also widely used for heating. When the oil shock struck, France realized just how dependent they are on foreign oil. And so, as a direct result of this, on the 6th of March of 1974, French Prime Minister Pierre Mesmer announced what became known as the Mesmer Plan, a hugely ambitious nuclear power program aimed at generating most of France's electricity from nuclear power. Nuclear power allowed France to compensate for its lack of energy resources by applying its strengths in engineering. The situation was summarized in a slogan: "In France, we do not have oil, but we have ideas." Germany too realized their dependence on foreign energy sources, but attempts at nuclear power plant construction were met with great public resistance. One of the best remembered demonstrations managed to prevent the construction of a nuclear power plant in Lille in 1975. The police were accused of using unnecessarily violent means against the protesters, but these protests ultimately managed to inspire strong nuclear opposition throughout Germany, which prevented the construction of new plants. Faced with such opposition, Germany decided to substitute one substance addiction with another. They switched from crude oil to natural gas, most of which came from Russia. But this transition from crude oil to alternative sources of energy created a problem for European oil companies and their refineries. An oil refinery, like the one you can see here behind me, is essentially a big distillery. What it does is that it boils crude oil and collects vapors in a tall column. Different oil-derived products have different boiling points, and so they liquefy at different heights in the column. The result of this process is that a typical barrel of crude oil inevitably creates a range of different products. In other words, it is impossible to obtain only gasoline, or only diesel, or only any other single product from a barrel of crude oil. If we did that, we would be left with a very large quantity of unused crude oil, and of course, nobody wants that. So instead, what we do is that we create a range of different products from a barrel, and then each of these products has its own market and its own application. The problem with the European oil processing industry in the years after the 1973 oil crisis was that they no longer had buyers for their heavy distillates, because the energy generation and the heating industries had transitioned to different sources.
Now, German oil processing giant Aral was actually very transparent and public about this situation, and they stated the following. Combined production requires the sale of certain amounts of gasoline and middle distillates. Since heavy oil sales are declining, this share has to be marketed as diesel after appropriate conversion. So to sum it up, diesel was around 40% of the output of the European oil giants. But they didn't have a market for it.
But oil refineries weren't the only ones impacted by the oil crisis. Vehicle manufacturers also suffered because the dramatic increase in fuel prices led to a dramatic decrease in car sales. So manufacturers sought to offer buyers more fuel-efficient alternatives in the form of vehicles with diesel engines, which are naturally more fuel-efficient than their gasoline counterparts. The main reasons behind this being that diesel engines naturally operate at noticeably higher compression ratios. They don't need a homogeneous air-fuel mixture and don't require a throttle body to function, which means that they can run at very lean air-fuel ratios and don't suffer from pumping losses. Some manufacturers like Peugeot were fortunate to already have a diesel option in their model range in 1973. But others like Volkswagen had no diesel offerings, so to save time and money, Volkswagen converted an existing EA827 Audi gasoline engine into a diesel version. To withstand the higher stresses present in a diesel engine, the crankshaft, connecting rods, pistons, and piston pins, as well as the cylinder head and timing belt, were reinforced or redesigned. Swirl chambers were added to the cylinder head, and in the place previously occupied by the ignition distributor, now was a vacuum pump for the brake booster. The Volkswagen Golf diesel entered the market in 1976. The diesel engine was heavier, noisier, and less powerful than its gasoline counterpart, but it was also more fuel efficient. Most early diesel cars were in general met with mixed reviews. But oil companies were quick to see the potential because with a little work, this could be the ideal market for their diesel fuels. Car manufacturers also saw a potentially profitable arrangement because the improved fuel economy of diesel cars allowed manufacturers to charge a premium for them. Because in the long run, the improved fuel economy would offset the increased vehicle cost and allow savings for consumers. But car manufacturers were not ready to undertake such a massive risk so easily. They were not ready to invest enormous amounts of research and development without knowing that there would be sufficient demand for their products. They wanted governments to create incentives which would guarantee this demand. They wanted governments to create the kind of incentives that would make diesel vehicles attractive and sensible, not just to taxi drivers or delivery vehicles, but to the average car buyer as well. So oil refineries and car manufacturers started to lobby the governments. But the governments could not respond to the demands of these key players in the economic and political stage of Europe without some sort of justification for the privileged tax treatment of diesel fuel and diesel vehicles. So the governments proceeded to create the justification for the kind of incentives that the oil industry and automobile industry had in mind. Enter the 1996 Auto Oil Program. This was essentially a joint effort of the European Commission, the European oil industry, and the European automobile industry with the goal of creating an assessment of future trends in CO2 emissions and air pollution as well as vehicle technology, and then creating a framework for policies and regulations based on this combination of research, estimates, and predictions. If you take the time to read through this seemingly incredibly boring and repetitive document, you will find how it sets a stage for presenting diesel vehicles as a key tool in reducing CO2 emissions in the future. This is justified by the fact that diesel engines and diesel vehicles are more fuel efficient and thus offer reduced CO2 emissions. At the same time, the document is very optimistic about how easy it will be to reduce nitrogen oxide and particulate matter emissions from diesel engines in the future. The auto oil program was followed up in 1998 by a voluntary agreement between the European Commission and European Automobile Manufacturers Association, or ACEA. This new agreement sought to achieve an average of 140 grams per kilometer of CO2 by 2008 from new passenger vehicles manufactured by members of ACEA. This reduction in CO2 was presented as an equivalent fuel economy of 5.8 liters per 100 kilometers for petrol and 5.2 liters per 100 kilometers for diesel engines. Upon signing the agreement, many manufacturers were quick to admit how they planned to achieve the target fuel economies, these new averages, by expanding their offer of vehicles with diesel engines and developing new diesel engines, and or further technologically advancing their existing diesel engines. Because achieving these fuel economies was simply easier and more cost-effective with diesel engines. Some manufacturers even went so far as to advocate a switch to diesels as an essential component of any strategy to cut CO2 emissions. In the year 2000, we got the Auto Oil 2 program, which builds upon the conclusions of Auto Oil 1 with more optimism about the ease of reducing nitrogen oxide and particulate matter emissions and about the CO2 reduction benefits of diesels. Based on these reports and agreements, governments of most countries in the European Union started modifying their legislation. Initially, it was just reduced taxes on diesel fuel, but soon many countries like France and Spain followed up with reduced taxes on diesel vehicles as well. On top of this, emission standards for nitrogen oxide were made less stringent for diesel engines. Euro 1 standards, which came in force in 1992, set the same hydrocarbon and nitrogen oxide limits for petrol and diesel engines as it was with most other emission standards around the world. But subsequent Euro 2, Euro 3, and Euro 4 all allowed noticeably higher nitrogen oxide limits for diesel engines. This made emissions control requirements less demanding and less expensive for diesels. Most other countries around the world kept nitrogen oxide limits equal or nearly equal for gasoline and diesel engines. And so legislation made it cheaper for manufacturers to develop diesel-engined cars, while at the same time they could charge more for such cars due to the fact that they offered better fuel economy. And on top of everything, manufacturers could claim that they are green and saving the world because allegedly diesel engines were reducing our carbon footprint. And thus the stage was set for manufacturers to pour most of their R&D efforts into diesel engines.
Early diesel engines for passenger cars weren't that impressive. They were slow, rough, and noisy. But after a lot of research and development, manufacturers started churning out engines like this one. You could still tell it's a diesel. But they were infinitely more refined and, more importantly, much more powerful. Turbocharging, a technology which is especially suitable for diesel engines, was one of the key reasons behind the improved performance. I remember back in the early 2000s when turbo diesels became more common, naturally aspirated petrol engines of equivalent displacement, which were previously the norm for passenger cars, all of a sudden started looking kind of silly, because not only did turbo diesels have noticeably improved fuel economy, in the real world they were also actually faster. Because with a turbo diesel, you never have to strain the engine to make progress. There is always ample torque available on tap, even from the lowest of RPM. So overtaking, merging onto highways, long distance travel, all of that becomes a breeze.
Faced with reduced taxation, improved fuel economy, and better performance and drivability in the real world, many buyers started switching to diesel-engined cars. But if we look at the data, it becomes obvious how dieselization was never a matter of user preference or different tastes in Europe and the US or other countries. If we compare Europe and Japan as an example, we can observe very similar low rates of diesel share in the market. The markets only start diverging when European legislation started strongly favoring diesels and creating incentives for buyers. If we observe Europe on a country-by-country basis, we can see that diesel adoption is highest in countries like France, for example, where legislation and taxation was very favorable for diesels. Diesel vehicle percentages remained noticeably lower, where incentives were lower too. But initially, it appeared that the mass dieselization of Europe was a win for everyone, because oil companies, they got a market for their diesel, car manufacturers got higher profits, consumers got better cars, CO2 emissions got reduced. Almost sounds too good to be true. Well, unfortunately, it soon became obvious that it was too good to be true, because as time moved on and emission standards got more stringent, it became evident that getting diesels to meet these new nitrogen oxide and particulate matter emission standards, despite favorable Euro emission standards, was much harder than originally envisaged by the Auto Oil 1 and 2 programs. And so manufacturers started reducing the compression ratio of diesel engines in order to reduce nitrogen oxide emissions, which sort of defeats the purpose of a diesel engine, because reducing the compression ratio also reduces efficiency and power output. To restore power, manufacturers then increased the boost pressure from the turbocharger, which led to increased CO2 emissions, which ultimately resulted in equivalent diesel and petrol engines having pretty much the same power output and the same CO2 emissions. To combat particulate matter emissions, manufacturers installed DPFs, or diesel particulate filters, a device that captured particulate matter and burned it off, but also got clogged if the vehicle was mostly driven in the city, leading to noticeably increased maintenance costs. On paper, reduced compression ratios and DPFs allowed diesel engines to meet newest Euro emission standards. On paper. In real-world conditions, things were very different, but the diesel deal was simply too good to let go. So governments around Europe kept weak and inadequate emissions testing in place to make it seem like diesel engines were passing emissions. The NEDC, or New European Driving Cycle, was a testing methodology last updated in 1997. It is largely based on laboratory testing in a very controlled and unrealistic environment where the vehicle is ran on a rolling road. This methodology failed to simulate real-world driving conditions, leading to emissions and fuel economy figures which were noticeably lower than those in the real world. Despite repeated criticism from both journalists and scientists, this testing methodology was kept in force and not updated for more than a decade, because it allowed manufacturers to keep manufacturing and selling diesel engines. But in 2015, it became evident just how far manufacturers were stretching the truth with diesel engines when it was discovered that Volkswagen had to cheat to pass US emissions testing. They had reprogrammed their vehicles to be able to detect when they are being emissions tested and then run their engines in a reduced performance mode in order to generate reduced emissions and pass the testing. When being driven in normal everyday conditions, these diesel engines were actually emitting 14 times more nitrogen oxides than the allowable US limit and 3 times more than the Euro 5 emission standard. When this was discovered, the Dieselgate scandal ensued. Volkswagen was fined billions and millions of vehicles were recalled. Most owners decided to sell their vehicle as performance, fuel economy, and responsiveness after the recall was noticeably reduced. Investigations into other manufacturers also followed, and it was discovered that the majority of diesel-engined cars on the market displayed massive emissions differences between real-world and laboratory testing. As one of the consequences of Dieselgate, NEDC testing was finally abandoned in Europe and replaced with the Worldwide Harmonized Light Vehicles Test Procedures, or WLTP, another laboratory test, but one that was actually based on a global statistical survey of real human driving profiles, and not made-up artificial and unrealistic ones. Euro 6 emission standards finally implemented nearly identical nitrogen oxide and particulate matter limits for diesel and gasoline engines. To meet them, diesel engines needed to inject diesel exhaust fluid into the exhaust stream, which was yet another complex and expensive system added to diesel vehicles, which also created an added maintenance cost for owners because diesel exhaust fluid is stored in a separate tank and must be topped up by the owner. But the most depressing fact is that the mass dieselization of Europe failed to reduce CO2 emissions. If we compare Europe and Japan once again, we can see how Japan in the long run was more successful in reducing its CO2 emissions because its legislation favored hybrid vehicles, which were of course made in great numbers by Japan's largest automaker, Toyota. New research has clearly demonstrated that Europe's carbon footprint from its passenger transport would have remained the same if the market share of diesels remained on the level from the early 90s. So we could have had the same carbon footprint but without the extra nitrogen oxides and particulate matter. And so after Dieselgate shed a light on reality, that which was once heralded as a savior of the environment was now demonized. Diesels were dirty once again. Legislation was reverted in many countries, sales of diesel vehicles started falling off, while sales of hybrids and electrical vehicles started increasing. The reign of diesel in Europe was over, but what remained in its wake were millions upon millions of vehicles with failure-prone and expensive-to-maintain emissions equipment. Many owners chose to not turn in their vehicle for a recall because they heard how this will negatively impact their performance and fuel economy. Many owners also deleted their exhaust gas recirculation, diesel particulate filters, and other emissions control systems when they were faced with the extremely high cost of servicing and/or replacing these devices. This is of course especially true in countries where emissions controls and technical inspections are less stringent and/or easier to bypass. The end result is that the dieselization of Europe not only failed to reduce CO2 emissions, but it exposed European citizens to dramatically increased levels of nitrogen oxide, nitrogen dioxide, and particulate matter emissions. Nitrogen oxides negatively impact the environment because they react with other elements and form smog and acid rains. But their impact isn't limited to the environment. They are also dangerous to humans. In the past 5 years, a great amount of scientific research and evidence has surfaced, which has presented undeniable evidence of the chronic health effects from long-term exposure to elevated levels of nitrogen dioxide, a chemical compound that is produced in higher percentage by more modern diesel engines. Nitrogen dioxide has been associated with both low birth weights and small head circumferences. It has also been associated with increased mental illness in children, autism spectrum disorders, and slow overall development in children. The European Environmental Agency calculated that in 2016, nitrogen dioxide pollution was responsible for an estimated 71,000 premature deaths across wider Europe. This pollution is largely attributable to road traffic. One of the main consequences of the mass dieselization of Europe is that concentrations of NO2 are above World Health Organization guidelines across much of Europe, with 7% of citizens living in areas where NO2 pollution is so high that it is rapidly deteriorating their health. The picture is equally bleak when it comes to particulate matter, which has been linked with illnesses and deaths from heart and lung disease. The World Health Organization has collected enough scientific evidence to state that the most harmful exposure to particulate matter is long-term exposure to fine particles, PM2.5, and diesel engines are the main sources of fine particles and increased air pollution in densely populated areas. The European Environmental Agency estimates that air pollution is responsible for over 450,000 premature deaths in Europe each year. So the price for Europe's love affair with the diesel engine was not paid by the governments that started it. It was ultimately paid by the citizens and the environment. But as one chapter closes, another one opens. Today, the governments of Europe are again modifying legislation and taxation to favor a different kind of vehicle. This time, it's the battery electric vehicle. With everything that we have experienced with diesel cars in mind, I truly hope that we have learned some very important lessons from our diesel episode. I hope that this time around, the governments are motivated by the interests of their citizens and the environment, and not the demands of energy companies and car manufacturers. I hope that this time around, the reports and estimates are not overly optimistic to justify a predetermined course of action. I hope that this time around, they have considered every possible scenario and side effect. I hope that in 20 years' time, I can look back on this video and say how there was no reason for me to be this skeptical. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching and have a nice day.